Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Adrienne. I'm one of the people partners here at Codility. We're a technical assessment platform where we test the skills of developers so that companies can make evidence-based hiring decisions. We're so excited you've decided to join us for our Unconscious Bias webinar today. And a special thank you to our event partners at Amazing Hiring. So we'll kick it off with a little intro of what we're going to chat about, and then I will let our panelists introduce themselves. So we've noticed that the HR community and companies writ large really over the last several years have gotten better at examining, caring about, discussing diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And we're excited to contribute to that conversation today as we focus on the important work of ridding discrimination from the hiring process. In particular, today, we're talking about the biases that we all bring to the table without intending to. Those are our unconscious biases. Before we kick off our conversation, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to share a quick introduction. And let's start with Margaret.
Hi, everyone. My name is Margaret Bui. I've been working in recruitment for 16 years, always in working for technology companies, both startups and large organizations such as Expedia or VMware. So throughout that time, I've recruited very internationally in most countries in Europe and also in the US for many different positions. And I've also done quite a lot of interview training and coaching, and I'm actually currently also running unconscious bias training within Typeform. So really excited about the discussion today.
Thanks, Margaret. Cam?
Hey, good afternoon, maybe morning some places. I am Cam. I'm the head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging at LiveRamp. I've been doing diversity work for well over 10 years now, both in the higher ed sector and now in the corporate tech sector. Now, a question everyone may have immediately, like, what the heck is LiveRamp? No worries, I got you. LiveRamp is the leading data connectivity organization and platform that makes it safe for our customers and easy to use data effectively. Now, you may say, well, what is that? I got you even further. You ever been online and you're shopping and you hit a product that you actually like, you go to another website and the product continues to pop up on the screens? That is actually LiveRamp powering that product for you. It's not Big Brother. It's not the government, dialed into your computer or your cell phone. It's us powering the product that you need in order to hopefully drive you actually buying a product. So that's what LiveRamp doing. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam. Why don't we kick it to Erika?
That makes sense. Cam and I work together. Erika Thorson. I oversee the talent acquisition function at LiveRamp. I have been in talent acquisition for more years than I care to say, but a decade or maybe two, in the full gamut. Recruiting is recruiting, in my opinion. So I've done technology, I've done manufacturing, I've done banking, I've done a little bit of everything, but really where my passion lies is around the leading of talent acquisition teams. And my passion outside of that as well is equitable hiring, making sure that we are bringing in diverse workforces, and diversity in whatever way you define that word. That's something that is super near and dear to my heart. But super excited to be here and really looking forward to the conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Erika. And now we'll go to Yulia with Amazing Hiring.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many countries here in the chat. I'm just reading the comments in the chat, and it's really exciting. We have people from all over the world. So hello, everyone. About myself, my background actually is strongly connected with talent acquisition. All my previous jobs were about talent acquisition, first graduate, and then in IT companies mainly. And then I joined Amazing Hiring. It was already 5 years ago. And since that time, we are helping many customers, both in States and in Europe, and now across the world, to source IT candidates, to source technical candidates, and we also help them to source for diverse candidates. This is one of the things that our technology helps recruiters to do. So I'm really excited to talk about it today, and looking forward to a great discussion.
Awesome. Let's kick it off. And for those of you who are joining us, please feel free to post your questions, and our lovely moderator, Louise, will kick them over to us so that we can answer contemporaneously as you have things come up. The first thing I wanted to start with today, team, was When we talk about bias in hiring, I think our natural instinct is to focus on that initial external hiring process of bringing somebody new into an organization. I think we probably should be encouraging organizations, though, to consider how unconscious bias is relevant both in our initial hiring process and in our internal promotion and interviewing processes. Margaret, when you and I had talked about this a little bit in the past, you said that you've got some experience with unconscious bias training. So I'd love to hear from you, and then from anybody else who'd love to chit chat with us about this. Talk about why ongoing unconscious bias training is important for all people managers, not just those who are on teams that are sort of regularly bringing in external talent.
Absolutely. I think first is to raise awareness. Obviously, behavioral change can take a long time, but there are plenty of people who think that they are just not biased at all. And obviously that's a problem. So even in the early hiring stages, a candidate's resume picture, their name, their hometown, their university could influence your opinion more than you think. So unconscious biases influence your decisions, whether positively or negatively, using criteria that are completely irrelevant to the job. And as you said, unconscious bias in recruitment is really common during that first stage, resume screening phase. This is when we move forward or reject applicants based on how close they are to our picture of the perfect candidate. But that's definitely not the only step of the hiring process where we should be looking at unconscious biases. So even when we decide to move a candidate forward despite a lingering feeling that they're not quite suitable for the role, that initial impression will follow or really kind of haunt us throughout the hiring process. And it's likely that we disqualify them at a later stage. So it's just really important to be aware of what the biases are, what their impact is, and I'm happy to talk about different types of biases as well. But the main point is that all of us, absolutely all of us, make judgments and assessments of people and situations that are influenced by our personal experiences, culture, and background. So some people call this blind spots, some people call it unconscious or implicit biases. And because this process is completely automatic and triggered by our brain making quick decisions, it may really show up in some small ways. So one way could be assuming that an older employee doesn't want to use the latest technology, or you might assume that a younger looking professional is not the leader of the team. And of course, it also shows up in some bigger ways as well. So unconscious bias definitely affects how we evaluate talent, performance, assignments, and promotions. And the personal effects of that unconscious bias could be really detrimental because employees who experience prejudice actively disengage and reduce contribution. So that's why I think the awareness and just the continuous training is very important, because it doesn't just happen at the initial hiring stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask a question to Margaret? From your experience, how often do you run those trainings? And is it like once as in first training when a new hiring manager joins in, or this is something that has a reason specific, so you kind of do it once a year?
Sure. Okay. So firstly, I've been at Typhoon since mid-January only, and I initially created first created the unconscious bias training for the talent team. Then I started running the interviewer training for the engineering team. And right now, I think we've had 65 people in engineering who've gone through that training. That also includes a shorter version of the unconscious bias. Because it's all done on Zoom right now, you can't, if I wanted to do it properly, that literally will be 5-6 hours on Zoom. You can't do that without people getting completely exhausted, including myself. So right now, the way it looks, we have a 2.5-hour training that's basically like a couple of hours in the interview training session, and just half an hour is the unconscious bias, which is just really an intro about different types of biases, what they are and how to avoid them. And it's normally maybe it's 45 minutes. It's just quite an interesting discussion, because some people are aware of the biases. It doesn't matter whether you know the name, but when you start giving people examples, that's when they realize, oh yeah, I've seen that, like even the group thing or confirmation bias, or the affinity, just like me bias. So people actually can really recognize that. So right now, I've done the interview training for most of the interviewers in the engineering team. I think that's 65 people right now. So Erika, no, I'm actually doing them myself right now. So.
Wow.
So I'm doing I've created the training. I'm doing the sessions myself. Our leadership team also has or had some unconscious bias training run by an external organization. But I think we will roll it out to other teams. It's all pretty new because I still have my main job is actually recruitment. So this is kind of a little outside task and my own initiative that I was, super excited to roll out. So right now there are some more sessions. To be honest, I've done it for a few different teams, like customer success team, but it's actually mostly engineering. So it will be rolled out, but we have the whole plan in terms of diversity and inclusion. So it's not going to be immediate. Right now, it's probably once a month. Yeah.
Margaret, I think this is probably something that resonates with a lot of folks on the call. There's this balance between whether your organization has the will and the budget to externalize this training, to bring in outside consultancies or firms to do it, or if you've got folks generally on the people ops side somewhere who are DIYing the training. Anybody on this group, maybe even Erika and Cam, what's your experience with sort of both sides of that coin, and how we can balance as people ops professionals the times where, we're really invested and convicted around the importance of training on this type of thing, but maybe you're up against some budgetary constraints that have you just kind of trying to build it at home.
Cam, do you want to jump in and I'll follow up?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I was going to say, hey, Erika, you want to go first? Here's the deal when it comes to unconscious bias. You definitely want to get some type of training out there. At the same time, you have to level set the goal of unconscious bias. You're not going to mitigate bias. Like, that's not going to happen, right? Bias is like air we breathe. It's what we are and who we are. I give a perfect example about, me being a Miami Dolphin fan. Anybody that's not a Miami Dolphin fan, I side-eye you all the time. But I'm okay because I understand where my bias is, and I know how to ask myself the why question, right, to turn my bias off. And I think that's what bias training should do. It should make you question why you thought that thing and then make you turn it off, right? So when at LiveRamp, we have the fortunate the fortunate ability to be able to do in-house training because we have individuals that are certified in unconscious bias, culture intelligence, microaggressive training. So what we do is we're able to provide platforms and opportunities for our live rampers to kind of dip their foot in the water a little bit and then go deeper. Right. We found that is the best way to introduce a new topic that may be hard for some individuals to grasp or understand, because like Margaret said before, some people don't even realize that they are biased. Right. So I think introduction, like Margaret talked about, and then submerging yourself a bit deeper is the best way to go when you're introducing these quote unquote sensitive topics. It's only sensitive because it makes you challenge your thought process that you had for years.
And I'll piggyback on that, Cam. Thank you for laying the groundwork. Is that we've done a little bit of both for our training. And Margaret, the reason why I asked you if it was instructor-led or web-led is that we did have just, bought off the shelf training that we would assign people that they'd have to go do it on their own time and go through it. And we just, you have to assume that they're not just clicking buttons to get through the training so that they can check off the box, right? Is that people were truly taking it seriously. Now our talent enablement team has built out more instructor-led trainings, which I think is going to be much more valuable to our teams. And we do have it where new hires go through it. All managers are required to do it annually, along with the typical annual requirement trainings. But it is something that we know it's a continuous conversation. It's not you hear it once and everything's fixed. Is that you might finally realize that there is one unconscious bias that you've identified it, and you really work on that. Guess what? Something else will pop up to take its place, right? So it's a continuum. And Margaret, I really liked how it's something that isn't just going to get fixed in 1 2-hour session.
No, but what you mentioned about web-led training, I think that could be incredibly useful. Even actually, when I was working for Avanade, we had a lot of training that came from Accenture because Avanade was a joint venture between Microsoft and Accenture. So we actually also did a web-based training on unconscious bias. It was exactly assigned, and we had to. Luis, no, I didn't actually base the training on. No. To answer your question, no. Luis is asking me if I based the training on Daniel Kahneman's work. No. So anyway, we did this web-based training that I think was incredibly useful. I don't think it was very expensive. In fact, just before this session, I had a quick look at online training for unconscious bias, and I've seen some options. I don't know how good they were, but they were even like £25 per person. So I don't think budget is an issue here. You know, if you want to do something, you will get something done, and I don't think you need to wait until you have really expensive external trainer. I really think you can do it quite inexpensively.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have a privilege and an obligation within our function here to say that we're going to take the first step, even if we're dragging some people along with us. You know, there will be different levels of enthusiasm, comfort.
Of course. Yeah. And also, because I think unconscious bias is just such a huge topic. Like my training is really mostly about unconscious bias in recruiting, obviously. You know, it's a wider topic. Mine was really focused on a little bit about, you know, how managers can avoid unconscious bias in terms of performance and evaluations, but it was really mostly about recruiting, because a lot of the people who are doing the training, they are managers or they are interviewers. So
yeah, one thing that we have in our applicant tracking system is that it's built in that reminds people as they're screening through candidates, don't forget to look at this candidate through a lens of diversity, right? And that's the wrong phrasing. I know that it says it much more eloquently than that, but there are reminders at every step for both recruiters, talent acquisition partners, hiring managers throughout the process. There's prompts every time that they go into our applicant tracking system to make sure from a recruiting perspective that they are trying to leave those unconscious biases at the door, which is helpful.
What ATS do you use, Erika?
We're on Greenhouse.
Oh, we as well. Okay.
It's a module that you have to buy, of course.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Nothing's ever free. You have to buy it, but it has been really helpful for us.
Great. We got a great audience question from Sarah that I want to kick to the group. She asks, it seems like disability is the next frontier for DEI and unconscious bias understanding and training. What have we as a panel seen in that space that's been effective in mitigating some of those biases, and or what are we hoping to see in the future? I think that dovetails with another question I was going to ask, which is how is bias manifesting differently, good or bad, in the era of virtual interviewing? I think that we can probably tie those two together.
I think there are two separate questions now, because one was the one about disability and then the one about virtual.
Yeah. Let's talk about the disability question first. I think it'll dovetail nicely into the piece about virtual hiring. From my perspective, I think one of the things that we've seen a lot during the pandemic is the way that remote work is an accessibility issue. You know, 2 years ago, folks with disabilities would often have a difficult time convincing their organization that they could work just as productively from home without having to navigate some of the issues that come with being in or getting to an office. To put it plainly, I think that ship has sailed, and any organization who's been able to work with people remotely for the last year and a half or 2 years no longer has a leg to stand on when failing to offer that as an accommodation for disability work. The question about what we've seen working well in mitigating these biases, I think is a little bit tougher for me to personally answer, because like Cam, like you were talking about, mitigating unconscious bias is actually really, really difficult. And somebody else mentioned in the comment section, some of the latest research is around the fact that mitigating unconscious bias isn't working as well as we might have hoped it would. So some of that piece of acknowledgement and training and just triggering people's spidey senses, for lack of a better term, when they might be having a moment of bias, I think that's the base level goal when we talk about unconscious bias training, is getting people to just have that pause moment where they can acknowledge, like, maybe I'm not looking at this correctly, which I think is relevant, whatever the bias that you're encountering is.
You know, I think one thing that this virtual space has done well for underrepresented individuals is proven the case that underrepresented individuals has probably been screaming for forever, is that you don't have to move to a certain city to be productive in your job, right? When you think about individuals having to move from their community and move to the West Coast, or move to New York, or now move to Texas, you know, there's a certain burden moving, then a certain comfort moving individuals from their community and dropping them into another space. some exciting, some not so exciting. But what the virtual space has taught us now is that we can now live wherever and work forever and still be just as productive. And if it wasn't for the pandemic, we probably would have never learned that lesson, because the bias shows, right, that if you live and work in the same city, that's the only way that it can actually work and we can be productive as companies. So if I was looking for a benefit, right, or something that's happened over the last maybe 20 months, is the fact of what individuals have been saying for forever is now coming to fruition.
Yeah, let's kick it to the part that I mentioned before. How are we, just anecdotally amongst this team, how are we seeing bias manifesting differently now that we're doing primarily virtual interviewing? When I think about this, it's sort of the way video background or low quality video ambient noise can bias us against less affluent candidates. That's not something we would have encountered when we had people coming into the office. The flip side of that being, some things about culture fit, style, even fat phobia, you don't get when you've got a shoulder up view of people. So I think there are probably positives and negatives, and I'm curious what you have observed in this area.
Yeah, Adrian, I agree, is that it's some good has come from it and some bad has come from it, right? Like you had said, is that there's the socioeconomic piece where maybe bandwidth isn't as great, or somebody doesn't have the means to be able to do video conferencing, or right. So that does put some candidates at a disadvantage, unfortunately. However, to the other side of it, it puts many people on a level playing field, because everybody is having the same experience. And it has also opened us up to candidates can be anywhere, is that we take some of that bias out of, they have to be in affluent areas, right? Is that before the pandemic, we're based primarily San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Boston, all fairly expensive places. Now we can look at candidates that are in, I use Bozeman, Montana as an example. So if there's anybody out there from Bozeman, Montana, I apologize in advance. But that's always my example, is that we can hire people in Bozeman, Montana, where they wouldn't have had that opportunity before, right? So we can look at candidates from a broader perspective, which in turn levels the playing field in that instance. But it does make it more difficult when, if you see, and we've thankfully gotten past this at LiveRamp, but when you see kids running in the background, which my kids happen to be at school, but 6 months ago, you wouldn't have. You would have seen them running back and forth, because that's just the way it is. Now, if somebody were interviewing me and they see these kids running back and forth, well, how could she not control her kids? How could she lead a team? Well, I can lead a team much differently than a 10-year-old that needs to get out some energy, right? It's been a mindset change, I think, of hiring teams. And we continuously talk about, look at the person and what they are qualified for. Are they meeting the job requirements? The background noise really shouldn't matter, because the background noise is everybody's noise now, right? There are dogs, there's cats, there's kids, there's UPS men, which I was talking about earlier, knocking on the door during conference calls. Life is happening around us now, and we all need to get better at identifying that and allowing that part to not impact our decision making. You need to set the bar against what the job requirements are, not what the person looks like, not what the background noise is, not anything else. It truly is based on their experience and if they're meeting that bar.
Erika, I'm gonna double down on what you just said, because what I thought about was parents and caregivers. Like the amount of bias that's how now has increased based on this virtual experiences is really unbecoming. Because you think about it all the time. You said kids running in the background. At first we used to apologize for these things. Now it's like, hey, this is how I live. And the more we normalize this new concept of the new way of working, right? The gold standard of working now, the better we will be. But there's in my opinion, a distinct bias against the parents and caregiver community and the differently abled community, or the individuals with disabilities, because of the fact that they meaning people work different to get the job done, and we're still trying to normalize that concept, which I would be an advocate for. Before I close up, I think everyone should be individuals in the way they work, and we as companies are charged with the responsibility to make sure we even the playing field to ensure everyone have the same experience.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Kim.
would
That's great. Oh, Yulia, did you have something to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to jump in and go one step further, one step before, because we are talking about screening and interviewing candidates. That means we already have those candidates, but there are many job openings right now, especially in tech, and we are working with many fast-growing startups and product companies, especially across Europe, where the demand for tech talent is growing, and the supply is not yet there at all. So as talent acquisition leaders, we actually have to create this supply. And there we have our own strategic power to create the pipeline of candidates as diverse as we want. And I think that's the great thing, and that's where technology as well helps us to do that. But of course, when the caregiving and some other positions might not be the case here, but for technology right now, it's very easy to source candidates online. There is this a lot of digital footsteps that we can track, where we can understand that, for example, the person comes from underrepresented group, and we can specifically bring in more and more candidates and teach our hiring managers. And because one thing is training, and we can have the official training, people would go through the training, something stays with them, but we don't know actually how many percent. So I think as talent acquisition leaders, we also should add some other actions from our side, like for example, creating the diverse pipeline. And that's very important.
Yeah, Yulia, that's a great point. I think when we had chatted ahead of this meeting, you mentioned something about blind hiring mode as a mechanism for mitigating unconscious bias in sourcing and recruiting. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, for example, in our system in Amazing Hiring, when you source for candidates, usually you see aggregated candidate profile, and you have access to all the original sources. You see the name, family name, usually the picture that can be an avatar from LinkedIn, for example, from some other social network. And then we can see information from his or her GitHub or Stack Overflow and Twitter link. So aggregated information that comes from different sources. And of course, that helps me as a recruiter to create an overall picture of a person. And when I create a pipeline and I want to show the list to my hiring manager, I can show the candidates in a blind hiring mode. That means that we would hide the name, the picture. We can even hide the educational institutions listed. So we would only highlight the most important things, the experience, the skills, something that's connected to work achievements. And based on this information, a hiring manager can make a decision whether to proceed with a candidate or not to proceed. And then we would come to the interview. And then in the interview, the magic, the chemistry happens. That's already the next step. But when we talk about sourcing here, we can be more strategic and actually push our point more within a company.
How do we think the actual writing of job descriptions impacts some of this bias in recruiting? I've seen it done, I'm sure we all have, I've seen it done well and poorly. But one of the tactics that I've found really useful when working with hiring managers is sort of the forcing function of saying, list to me your criteria for success for this person in 90 days and 6 months, and then reverse build your job description off of that. That's my preferred mechanism for sort of structured interviewing, but I would love to hear how all of your teams cope with that need to bring a little bit less of a qualitative lens and more of a quantitative focus to how we start the recruiting process with job descriptions.
It's some data behind that, and I'm not going to give specific numbers because I don't know them specifically. But for many of us on the call, sorry, Cam, you're the outlier on this one. But as many of us have heard, is that women expect to hit every single one of the criteria that's listed on a job description, where men stereotypically, if there's just one thing that they've been able to do that's on that job description, they apply to the job, right? And that's a bias by women that are applying for jobs, right? Is that's us looking at, oh, well, I don't have all 15 qualifications here, I shouldn't apply. That's where we as leaders need to get better. And that's where the sourcing activities come in, right? Is that if we go out and we source somebody that may not meet 100% of those qualifications, that's going to help us pull some of that out. It doesn't necessarily lead to the job description part, outside of making sure that the must-haves that are on a job description truly are deal breakers. If people do not have that it's a deal breaker, right? There's a nice to have versus a must-have. We need to look at that a little bit differently. We do utilize tools also. We use the Textios of the world, right, to make sure that our language is androgynous as best it can be. You know, we're looking for a rock star, ninja, all that stuff, the buzzwords, because that leads towards men, right? Is that we've been very cognizant around that, primarily around our engineering world. That's where we've found that biggest challenge. So by using that tool, it's helping us refine our job descriptions to make sure that it's catering to the entire population, not just to the white male under 40, as an example, is that we want to make it much more broad than that.
So Erika, we are doing exactly the same. I've used Textio in one of my previous positions. We use Data People right now, which is a very similar tool to Textio. And actually, I spent the whole afternoon yesterday improving these jobs. It was actually so interesting. Some of them, I thought they were quite good, but the score was like, 60s, I don't know, 50 or 66. Now they're all between like 92 and 99, which, I mean, let's see how it goes, because I literally did it yesterday. We started using the tool recently, but you're completely right. All of these words like aggressive, drive, all of these words that are really more oriented at male candidates, I think they might detract female candidates from applying. So you definitely need to have the must-haves for the position, but just the language you use is very important. So I'm actually really curious to see what the conversion rate would be from the new job descriptions.
Yeah, and on a true tactical level, I think if folks can take away anything from this part of the conversation, it's on those must-haves on your job, be really, really sure if you use like number of years of experience, have a good reason for that, right? Like don't pick 5 because it feels middling. If you're going to give a number of years of experience, you should have a really good logic train on how you got there and why time in seat was a metric that you care about.
Adrian, to add on to that is that we've been very cognizant of when we get job descriptions, we challenge our hiring teams of why is a degree required? What is it? Because that right can knock out a lot of people just from a socioeconomic piece because they couldn't afford to go to college, or they're taking care of family and that was their priority, but they worked. So they have this work experience. So we're really challenging our hiring teams is why is that degree needed? What skill set would those candidates potentially not have by not having a 4-year degree or a master's degree, whatever it might be? That's something that has really helped us turn the corner.
That's a fantastic example, and something that I worked with a colleague at my last company on, was going through every single position and deciding why did we think a college degree was required for that. One of the things in the U.S. that can unnecessarily weed out is people with excellent military experience. Like that is on the job training, that is, proof of concept working in difficult situations. And you're saying because you didn't finish your bachelor's degree, like we're not interested, that's a requirement. And so that's, some folks on the comment section had asked about tactical ways that you can mitigate these unconscious biases. There are things that we can do that are based at a systemic level and not at an individual level. And examining our requirements when it comes to job descriptions is a really solid way that we can take some of these biases out of contention before we even get started in the recruiting process.
Can I add one thing? From my personal experience hiring into my team, one of our main sources of candidates is referrals, and people do recommend us a lot. And so what I did, and maybe that could be also helpful for some of you guys, we created an informal job description, which I actually share as a Notion page. And one of sub-pages there is like a short stories about our employees. And we have a lot of diverse employees. And by sharing like glimpses of their stories, I do believe that creates a good impression that we as a company already have this culture and we already have these diverse people. So, that is something that I know that a lot of companies do have employee stories on the website, but sometimes it's a little bit too formal. I don't know. That's what I think. A little bit of this informal information and sharing the stories, and actually we add the Facebook links so the candidates can actually check that these are real people. They all work here with us, and they can even chat if they want and ask some questions before applying. And that has worked really good for us, especially with junior positions, because a lot of people that graduate from the same school or from the same university program, they do like to check their colleagues and apply afterwards. So I think everything starts with building the diverse culture inside, and that brings more diverse candidates as well.
Yeah, Yulia, I was to layer onto that is that I am a huge proponent of employer referral programs as well. As long as your current employee base, though, is diverse, is that if your employee base is not diverse, it's homogenized, guess what? All those referrals are going to look exactly like the people that you already have. So it's being really conscious about that when you start and you launch that employee referral program and how it continues to evolve over time. That's something that in a handful of companies that I've been at, we've had that challenge because it has, referrals are great, right? And we can attest to that person and whatnot, but it has homogenized some of the organizations that I've been at, and that's something that we want to avoid.
How would you restructure that? What to do if you already have a perfectly working program, but it brings similar people? What would you recommend?
Yeah, go ahead, Cam.
Oh, no, I was just going to help out. Oh, no, I had a thought because that's exactly what I was thinking about. Like, what is the solve, right? So here's how I would solve for it. I will actually make sure that my candidate slates have diverse candidate slates. Now, when people think about diverse candidate slates, they think about the types of people on the candidate slate before you present to your hiring manager. What I think about is the percentage of where you source from in order to ensure that the candidate slate is diverse. So if we take 20% from employer referrals, 20% from National Black MBA, 20% from the Hispanic MBA, so 20% from women. Now we still have 100% total, but the where we source from is an equal playing field for anyone versus the types of people, right? So now we've moved away from the targeting of individuals as a diverse candidate slate. And we worked on our external partnerships, which I'm sure all of us have, in order to make sure that we have the best and brightest candidate from each association.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm going to grab an audience question really quickly. I asked, what are some specific ways that recruiters or hiring managers can reduce specific unconscious biases? So the way I'm going to reframe this is, maybe if you can tell me what's an unconscious bias you've observed happening either in yourself or in colleagues, and what is the mechanism for stopping that in its tracks and backtracking it? Because I think one of the themes we're getting from questions here is people being like, yeah, I get it. I understand unconscious bias, but like, what am I supposed to do about it?
Sure. I mean, I can give a couple of examples. I'm sure there are more. So it's like, for example, a very common bias that I have seen in pretty much every one of my recruiting jobs is that affinity bias, which is the similar to me bias. It's just really the most common hiring bias, because anytime we lean towards candidates who maybe look or behave as or are just similar to ourselves, that's called that similar to me effect or affinity bias. So it's human nature to feel comfortable around people who resemble our own thinking. However, passing over more qualified candidates in favor of people that you feel comfortable with, that's actually a form of bias. So, while sharing things in common is an incredibly human instinct, it's important that we just don't allow this familiarity to color our decision making, because making decisions based on favoritism or similar background, because maybe we went to the same university or we work for the same company, that's actually unconscious bias. So for example, in the workplace, if the person you have to write an evaluation for is someone who graduated from your university, you might rate them much higher than a person with whom you have little or no connection. So unconsciously, the person with whom you have perceived affinity will automatically have an edge over the others, whether they deserve it or not. And also when companies hire, and many companies hire for culture fit, they also likely falling prey to that affinity bias, because when people meet someone, when hiring teams meet someone they like and they know will get along with the team, it's more often than not because that person shares some similar interests, experiences, and backgrounds, but that's not helping the team grow and diversify. So similarities, of course, shouldn't disqualify a candidate, but they shouldn't be the deciding factor either. So how do you actually avoid that affinity bias? So reducing our unconscious bias as we interact with others at work can be accomplished by creating standard processes that will help you to pause before you react in favor of or to the detriment of someone in the review process. So working off a structure that you can apply to everyone will help to lessen the influence of bias in your decision-making process. So that standardization, I think, is very important in hiring. For example, for our engineering positions, we have a pretty standard process of system design interview and live coding and a behavioral interview. And for the technical interviews, the interviewers don't even review their CV. So that's completely blind, hiring in that respect. So that also could be one way. But also, if you say you're a manager, think about the last time you chose someone that to work with, So why did you choose that person? And if you have written a 360-degree review for a teammate, were your comments objectives or based on feeling because you like them? So minimizing bias is not impossible. And with that standard process and being conscious, I think you can just make a really positive difference that can be seen and felt by others around you. I was a long answer. It's just one bias and there are many of them, but this is just standardized process will be a really good way to avoid affinity bias, for example.
I will add a +1 to that, is that a standardized process does take as much bias out as you can. The affinity part is always hard, right? Because you see somebody that looks like you, that has the same background. That's hard to take out during standardized processes, but it does, that standardized practice, making sure that everybody gets asked the same question, that you're measuring to the same bar, so important. I want to lead into a question that was pointed towards me specifically around LiveRamp and our recruiting processes. Our process has evolved so much over the last 3 years, is that and so I will answer the question as yes, we have figured out ways to take out the bias of the way that our process was run before. And I'll just give some color behind this, is that prior to me coming on board to LiveRamp, we had what some people called an awesome assessor, or they called it a talent ambassador. So candidates would go all the way through, and at Amazon, they call it a bar raiser. Candidates would get all the way through the interview process. Everybody be thumbs up, we love this person. But then there's a third party LiveRamper that would come in and do an awesome assessor interview, which basically was a culture fit interview. And that made the hair on the back of my head stand up, because that just did not feel right. So that was one of the first things that I actually changed when I came to LiveRamp, is that just fed into the bro culture, is that it did not help us diversify. It helped ensure that people were fitting into what LiveRamp was, rather than adding in value. And that's what we really preach a lot now, is that we're not looking for culture fit. We're looking for a culture add. And we get that throughout the interview process. We don't bring in a third party that really has no buy-in on the role to qualify a candidate, is that it is built in with all of our hiring teams throughout the interview process. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I answered that one question, because it was a pretty important piece that I wanted to call out.
Yeah, and Keith in the comment section made a great point that culture fit is sort of an opposite pole to diversity. Sometimes it comes off a little pithy, but we've transitioned from culture fit to culture add. And it's a risk that becomes a buzzword, just the way culture fit was 10 years ago. But I think the crux of the issue is that we're talking about where are we going, not where are we now.
Yep.
One thing I wanted to switch gears just a little bit before we run out of time here is talking about why companies might bring in a DEI leader. It's something that we've seen a lot in the last 5 years. I think advance a lot in the decade previously. It was fairly uncommon, but I think especially in our space in technical recruiting, bringing in a leader who has true expertise and not homegrown expertise in this arena. I think there's real value to it. And I'd love to hear, Cam, maybe from you, obviously, to start about, the value, purpose, strategy, and then tactically, how do you source and hire for somebody in your role?
Cool. So can I back up 1 second? Because I really want to share just from the last conversation, just the bias that always happened that I just had to call out. And I was laughing when you asked the question because it happens all the time. Just because you go to an underrepresented conference that says National Black MBA, National Hispanic MBA, Prosponica, Women that's not all the candidates that are there. People automatically assume when they go to these types of conferences, they're going to actually get the people that the conference is named after. That is a huge bias. I remember at one point I was working with a team and we went to a conference and we was vetting candidates, and they go, "Well, Cam, why are all the candidates different from the actual conference?" And I go, "Well, were you expecting everybody to be the same?" And that would lead to a 30-minute conversation. So I just wanted to call that out as a way to mitigate bias and understand that we walk into spaces based on the name and expect certain outcomes. That's not always the case. So fast forward. Why do you need DIB, diversity experts? Is because you want to always understand that there's different vantage points and different ways of thinking and ways that people interact. And we need to acknowledge and understand that people are different. And we need to build a culture where truly everyone belongs. Now, diversity isn't just a passion project, but it's purposeful work. All right. There's a strategy behind it. There's a business add to it. And the more diversity work, we call it diversity, inclusion, and belonging at LiveRamp, but the more diversity work is ingrained and integrated into the business of the organization, the more sustainable that it is. It's not about just making people feel good. It's about making sure people belong and people have space and voice, education, and access to be the best versions of themselves at work. The only way you can effectively do that with individual subject matter experts that show up every day thinking about this stuff, thinking about it across the board, and then globally, right? So that's the reason behind this work. This work is, feel good at some point, make you want to belong, but at the same point, it has a business impact that supersedes all of this, which means that sure, we want you to belong, but at the same time, we want to drive the business as well. You only drive the business through making diversity a part of the DNA of the company. Diversity is good business at any company.
Okay, so tell me, how do you source and who do you hire? What are your criteria for success?
So it's easy because I have my teammate on the line and we talk very often. So Erika and I, we get really innovative. I come to Erika with some of the most outlandish ideas half the time. But we have one program that we call Project Greenlight, where we literally try to hire on the spot. We go to a conference, we meet people, and in 72 hours, they have an offer in hand. We source for the greatest and the brightest talent around the world, no matter who and what they are. At the same time, we are very intentional about our efforts. If we say we're going to do it, we're going to do it. We're not going to go to a conference and just collect thousands of resumes and figure out what to do with them later. We're intentional about who and what we want at our company. And because of that, we have projects like Project Greenlight. We work with early career on the university level. But what we're thinking about in our mind is not transactional. We don't just want to go drop a bunch of money at a university and say, hey, hand me your students. What we've learned over time from talking to different CEOs from associations is that they care about the partnership over the long term. So now we're in partnership 2, 3, 4 years with universities, with associations, in order to make sure not only do we recruit, but we retain the talent, because you could get them through the door, but if they don't stay past 1 year, what's the point?
I think that transition is interesting to lead to something that we've been talking a lot about at Codility, which is employee resource groups. Whatever you call them at your own organization, that is sort of a critical component to that retention piece, because if retention doesn't work at your organization, you're biting yourself in the butt having to go back and do more recruiting and bringing in externally. One of the we stood them up recently. We're only 150 people at Codility, but we've added to our hiring process the opportunity for a candidate to speak with a leader of any of our ERGs at any point during the process. That's completely separate from the actual interviewing process. There's no assessment, there's no evaluation, there's no reporting back to TA. So it's sort of a true pseudo-anonymized mechanism for a candidate to be able to ask candid, honest, uncomfortable questions of somebody that they're not trying to impress. So to the extent that, you know, your organizations on the call and the folks that are joining us have opportunities like that, we've found that particularly for people from underrepresented groups who maybe they're interviewing with a whole bunch of people who don't look like them just by force of the fact that we are still working to diversify our organization. This gives an opportunity to say, here's our money where our mouth is, right? Like we've got room to grow, but we're trying. And I think that that's just something to keep in mind, is that, again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
Put the effort in to making the change and acknowledge that it's going to take time no matter where your organization is. Okay, we have about 9 minutes. Let me kick back to see if we have any other questions from the audience that we want to talk to before we run out of space. This is an interesting one. How has hiring in different countries and different cultures affected bias? And I'm adding on to this one, like, what do we do to mitigate that fact? You know, at Codility, we have hubs in San Francisco, London, Berlin, and Warsaw. So language barriers or language differences in level of comfort with English, you know, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, America, especially, yeah, Yulia, I think you have a lot of experience recruiting across a bunch of different markets. So I'd love to hear from you on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think it differs, but after the pandemic, it's more and more similar all across the world, because now we have unprecedented access to talent. And especially in technical recruitment, again, where the supply is much less than the demand, technology companies are using this benefit a lot, using and abusing it, I would say, because that sometimes create different problems as we see with salaries, for example, but that's another interesting story. Not sure if you have time to discuss that, but what's interesting, again, is that now we have an access to professionals working from everywhere in the world, and with the right technology, with the right strategy, we can actually access talents that we didn't have an access to before. And I still see that, especially in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union countries, it's still not that popular, but guys, it's growing so rapidly. It's so interesting. People are trying new. They're trying to diversify the teams and start hiring people from other countries. So I think that's our future. The distributed teams. Then we have the technology to help with communication, you know, with shared working spaces. We don't have any other obstacles, and yeah, that's quite cool. I totally believe in the technology here in this regard.
I think one of the things that we've noticed is country by country, people's preference for true permanent remote work differs. Mm-hmm. So I'm true permanent remote based in Portland, Oregon. So I'm not in our hub in San Francisco. And you would have to double my salary to convince me to ever commute anywhere ever again. Not everybody feels that way. You know, I have a kid and a house with multiple rooms. Like those are all things that go into me factoring my working preferences. And so some of the biases that we can bring at an organization level, if we're not polling our employees, is the assumption that your people ops team is representative of working preferences just by virtue of the fact that you're the ones discussing it. So I think that the true way to mitigate some of this stuff is to ask what your people want. A lot of our team in Warsaw is more inclined to go into the office than our team in the US, which is more spread out and diverse. And, you know, even folks who are in the SF area are not generally coming into the office every day. So acknowledging that people bring different preferences based on location, based on personal demographics. Age and caretaker status is a big one that we've noticed in preference for this. So to the extent that your organization is able to be flexible, and flexible doesn't necessarily mean fully remote, ask your people what they want, and don't assume that you know without asking.
Mm-hmm.
I think many companies are at that tipping point, right? Because not everybody has said our offices are open yet, right? So many companies are really coming to the point of inflection of what does it look like? Is it a flex work model? And by country, right? So by geo, it does matter. And what does that look like? I know that it's something that we've been talking about at LiveRamp for the last 12 months at least, because it has really changed the way that we do business and the way that we interact with each other as employees and teammates. So we're going to come out the other side of all this with a whole different way of working, which I'm super excited about, but change isn't always easy. But it does give us this opportunity to be able to, I don't want to say cater to the employee base, but make sure that we're hearing what the employees want rather than just assuming that, well, this is how business works. Not necessarily. Is that everybody's been pretty well functioning over the last 18 months, which is great. So
even
now
if
we
we
get
are
to move
deeply
forward.
exhausted.
Exactly. Point taken.
Okay, I've got one more question, and I think this is a tough one, so I'm truly curious to hear if anybody on this call has come up with a good answer to this. How can we filter unconscious bias when we're gathering references from past employers?
My answer is probably not going to be popular. I'm not a fan of reference checks. So if somebody gives me a reference name, guess what? They know, they've vetted that person. They've told that person that I'm going to call them.
Mm-hmm.
And there has not been one time where somebody's like, I would pass on that person. So I actually, unless one of my hiring teams is adamant on having a reference check done, I actually give it to the hiring team to say, you go make that phone call because you know exactly what you're concerned about and what questions to ask. I personally don't think that references, are necessarily viable necessary. Maybe that's a better word. I don't think that they're necessary in our processes.
So why do you think we're so reticent to let go of them? Because I echo that sentiment.
I've let go of them. I have told everybody at LiveRamp that I do not believe in them. And if somebody's adamant, I let them do it themselves. There are some people that though hold on to it because that's the way that it's always been, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's the comfort of, it's the way it's always been. I need to qualify what I saw in the candidate that somebody else saw the same thing that has worked with them in the past.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it feels super biased in and of itself because you're only getting what that candidate provides to you from a reference perspective.
Margaret, you're on mute.
So I agree with what you've said, Erika. Even though we do the references exactly, you would not give a reference. Although actually I had one situation when I've called the reference, I've actually emailed the reference that the candidate has given me. The guy was like silent for 30 seconds. He's like, I can't believe he gave you my name. I fired him. But that happened that happened only once. But what could be useful regarding references? I think maybe not for every single position. And it's maybe when you talk to someone in person is to just find out how can I help this person succeed? So as an example, we've hired someone recently at the VP of engineering level, and our CTO had a conversation with the previous boss of that candidate just to really find out how can we set them up for success. So I think references can be useful. I mean, it wasn't maybe so much a reference. It was a reference call, but you may be asking for a little bit more, not just like, person good, would you hire them? But how can we help them, like how can we set them up for success? It could be useful when you can have, it depends what questions you're asking.
I think that that's a great point. Maybe what we're talking about here is a shift from what we expect from references. It's not, is this person good to work with? It's, we're planning to hire this person. Here's something that came up during the interviewing process that I would like your help determining how we can set them up for success. That's honestly, it's more likely to get the reference talking in a useful manner as well when they don't feel like they're being grilled or like at risk of impacting the likelihood of, a former colleague getting an offer.
I also think the hiring manager should do that call because like recruiters, we don't have time to, I have time to send the reference form, which is a few questions, takes them 5 minutes, but I absolutely no way I will have the time to be calling everyone. So.
And also to your point, Margaret, to your point, Margaret, is having the hiring teams conduct it. They know what they're trying to get to, right?
Yeah.
Whereas recruiters, we're not the technologists. We're not the subject matter experts at that. It really should be owned by the leaders.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are officially at time, and I'm loath to keep folks late, especially since I know we have so many folks who've joined us from Europe, which is wonderful. But thank you guys so much for joining. Our panelists, thank you for taking time to chat with us, and our partners at Amazing Hiring. We're really stoked to have been able to do this with you, and you can find all of us on LinkedIn if you have follow-up questions. I'm sure we would love to chat with you and get to know everybody who was able to join.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.